He called me a burden. My own son, the one I fed when I went hungry, the one I sheltered from storms, told me I didn't belong in my house. I still remember the sound of his voice that evening. It wasn't loud, but it tore through me like broken glass. Ethan stood in the living room, his wife Rebecca by his side, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if guarding her pride. I had cooked dinner, as I did every Sunday. The smell of roasted chicken and buttered rolls filled the air, but that night, the warmth never reached the table. Something had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, and it finally boiled over when Rebecca said she wanted to renovate the house. She said it casually at first, like a woman suggesting new curtains, but then she looked straight at me and added, "Marissa, it's time you think about moving somewhere quieter. Maybe a senior place?" Her words hit harder than a slap. I felt the blood drain from my face. Ethan stayed quiet at first, his eyes darting between us like a boy caught between fire and water. I waited for him to speak, to defend me, to say what any son should. But instead, he looked at me and said softly, "Mom, maybe she's right." I froze. The plate in my hand trembled. "What did you just say?" My voice came out lower than I expected, almost a whisper, but I could hear the heartbreak underneath it. "I mean," he stammered. "This house, it's really hers now, Mom. You gave it to us." His words echoed. "You gave it to us. The papers, the transfer. I had done it years ago, thinking it would make his life easier, never imagining that one day it would be used against me. This was your father's house," I said quietly, staring at the floorboards that had known our laughter and our tears. "I worked 3 jobs to pay it off after he died. And you're telling me I don't belong here?" Rebecca sighed dramatically, her polished nails tapping the table. "No one said that, Marissa. Don't twist my words. It's just, you're getting older. You need peace, not chaos." Peace. That word stung more than the insult itself. She said it like I was the chaos, like my very presence disrupted her perfect little world. I looked at my son again. His jaw tightened. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be," he said. "We just need space." Something inside me cracked then, quietly, like porcelain splitting in slow motion. I had spent decades loving him unconditionally, standing in the rain waiting for him after football games, praying for him when he was sick, and believing that the bond between mother and son was unbreakable. But that night I realized love could shatter too. "You'll get all the space you need," I said, my voice steady but trembling underneath. "You can have it all." I walked to the hallway closet and took out the old tin box where I kept spare keys. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the last pair and threw them onto the counter. "If this isn't my home anymore, then it's all yours. Every inch of it." Rebecca's lips curled into something that looked like satisfaction. Ethan tried to reach out, but I stepped back. I saw the panic flash in his eyes for just a moment. He hadn't expected me to actually walk away. I went to my room, packed a small suitcase, and took my old Bible from the nightstand. It was worn and heavy with prayers I had whispered through decades of storms. I walked out without another word. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and clean. For the first time in years, I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I drove to the edge of town and parked near the lake where my husband and I used to sit on summer evenings. The moon reflected on the water, trembling like my heart. I sat there until dawn, replaying every moment, every word, every tear. At sunrise, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a ghost in my own life anymore. The next morning, I came back, not to beg, not to fight, but to reclaim something I had forgotten, my dignity. I walked into that house before they woke up. The coffee pot was still half full from the night before. I went straight to the front door and changed the locks. My hands didn't shake this time. Every click of the screwdriver felt like a heartbeat returning. When Ethan came down the stairs, still in his robe, his eyes widened. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Protecting what's mine," I said simply. "You wanted space. Here it is." Rebecca appeared behind him, disbelief painted across her face. "You can't do this. The house is ours." "Maybe on paper," I said, "but walls remember who built them. And these walls remember me." Ethan looked torn, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning for air. Mom, please. Let's just talk. There's nothing to talk about, I said quietly. You wanted me gone. Now you're the ones leaving. And with that, I opened the door, not to welcome them in, but to show them out. They left that morning, angry, humiliated, vowing I'd regret it. Maybe I would. But as I stood there alone, the morning sun spilling across the living room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The silence was sharp, but it wasn't cruel. It was peaceful. And as the light touched the family photos on the wall, I whispered to my late husband's picture, I'm taking my life back. Yet, even as I said it, deep down, I knew the battle was only beginning. Love doesn't end neatly. It bleeds, it lingers, and sometimes it comes back in ways you never expect. The house was quiet for days after they left. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your chest until you can hardly breathe. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of nothing. No coffee brewing, no footsteps creaking above me, no laughter, no arguments. Just the ticking of the old clock in the kitchen, counting seconds like a heart that refused to stop beating. At first, I told myself I was fine. I told myself peace was what I wanted. But peace has a way of turning into loneliness when there's no one left to hear it. On the third day, I went to the market out of habit. People there knew me, smiled politely, asked how I was doing. I lied. I'm fine, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. But when I got home and put the groceries away, the quiet swallowed me again. I found myself talking to the walls like an old friend who no longer answered back. Do you remember when Ethan took his first steps here? I whispered to the living room. He fell right there by the couch, and I cried more than he did. I laughed softly to myself, but it cracked halfway through. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the sunset fade behind the maple trees. I thought about Ethan, the little boy who used to run through the sprinklers, the teenager who promised he'd always take care of me. Somewhere along the way, the world had changed him. Or maybe I had changed. Maybe love itself had changed. On the fifth night, the phone rang. It was Susan, my neighbor and oldest friend. Marissa, honey, I just wanted to check on you, she said gently. Haven't seen you around much. Her voice was soft, but I could hear the concern hiding beneath the words. I'm managing, I said, though my throat tightened. You don't sound like you're managing, she replied. You sound like a woman who's trying not to cry. I didn't answer. You know, she continued, I saw Ethan at the grocery store yesterday. He didn't look too good, said things have been rough since they left. I closed my eyes, my heart twisting in that old familiar ache. He made his choice, Susan. And you made yours, she said quietly. But choices don't erase love, Marissa. They just make it harder to find again. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the dark, staring at the empty chair across from me. I hated how right she was. Even after everything, a part of me still ached for my son. Not for his apology, I didn't need that anymore, but for his presence. For the way he used to call me Mama when he needed something, or Ma when he was trying to make me laugh. The next morning, I decided to clean the attic. It was something I had been putting off for years. Dust gathered in the corners, boxes stacked like forgotten memories. As I opened one labeled Ethan's Things, a wave of nostalgia hit me. Inside were drawings he made in kindergarten, crooked stick figures and bright suns. One of them said, I love you, Mommy. The colors had faded, but the words were still there, strong and clear. I sat down on the floor, clutching the paper to my chest, and cried for the first time since they left. I cried for the little boy who used to need me, for the man who forgot he did, and for the mother who still loved him anyway. By the end of the week, I started getting calls from unknown numbers. I didn't answer the first few, but one afternoon curiosity won. Hello? I said softly. Silence at first. Then a familiar voice, cracked and hesitant. Mom, it's me. My heart skipped. Ethan? Yeah, he said, his voice trembling. Can we talk? For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The anger I thought I'd buried rose again, fighting with the longing I had tried to deny. I don't know, Ethan, I said finally. What is there left to talk about? I was wrong, he said quickly. I know that now. Rebecca and we shouldn't have said those things. We shouldn't have treated you that way. His words poured out in a rush, but they felt rehearsed, uncertain. Where's Rebecca? I asked. She's here, he admitted. She wants to talk to you too. No, I said firmly. If she has something to say, she can say it through you. He went quiet for a long time. I miss you, Mom, he whispered finally. The house doesn't feel right without you. Nothing does. I closed my eyes, feeling tears prick the corners. Sometimes love needs distance to learn what it lost, I said softly. But that doesn't mean it's gone. Can I come by? He asked. My instinct screamed no. My pride wanted to keep the door locked forever. But my heart, that foolish, forgiving heart, couldn't ignore the sound of my son's voice breaking. Tomorrow, I said after a pause. Come tomorrow afternoon. When I hung up, my hands were trembling. I sat by the window that evening, watching the light fade again, wondering what kind of man would show up at my door. The son I raised or the stranger who broke my heart. I prayed for the first time in weeks. Lord, I whispered, if this is the start of something new, give me strength. And if it's just another wound, help me bear it. The next morning, I woke before dawn and made coffee the way Ethan used to like it. Strong, with just a touch of sugar. I set 2 mugs on the table. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the day might bring. I was ready, but I had no idea that what was coming would change everything again, in ways I could never have imagined. The day Ethan was supposed to come, the morning light felt heavier than usual, like it knew something was about to shift. I woke before sunrise, unable to sleep, pacing through the kitchen as the coffee brewed. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper memories. The worn sofa where Ethan used to fall asleep watching cartoons. The chipped plate I could never bring myself to throw away because it reminded me of our Sunday dinners. Even the creaking floorboard near the hallway sounded like his laughter echoing back from another life. I tried to distract myself by tidying up, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I kept checking the clock, each minute dragging slower than the last. Around noon, I heard a car pull up in the driveway. My heart leapt and sank at the same time. Through the window, I saw Ethan step out. He looked thinner, older, and tired in a way that broke me. His eyes, once full of fire, now carried something else, guilt. Beside him, Rebecca climbed out of the car, her posture stiff, her face unreadable behind oversized sunglasses. For a moment, I thought about locking the door and pretending I wasn't home. But I'd promised myself that fear would no longer dictate my life. I opened the door before they even knocked. Hi, Mom, Ethan said, his voice low. Hi, I replied quietly. My gaze flicked to Rebecca. She gave me a small nod, polite but distant like someone entering a stranger's house. The silence between us was thick enough to choke on. I motioned for them to come in. The moment they stepped inside, I felt the tension settle into the room like a ghost returning to haunt us all. Ethan glanced around awkwardly, his eyes landing on the photos still hanging on the wall. I saw him pause at one, the picture of him at his college graduation, the day I thought I'd never stop smiling. Coffee, I offered, trying to sound casual. Please, he said, almost grateful for the distraction. Rebecca sat down at the table but didn't touch the mug when I placed it in front of her. Her eyes darted toward the window as if she were already planning her escape. For a few long moments, none of us spoke. The ticking clock filled the silence again, steady and relentless. Finally, Ethan broke it. Mom, I've been thinking a lot, he began, his hands gripping the coffee cup. About everything that happened. About how wrong I was. His voice cracked slightly, and it startled me. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who cried easily. I said terrible things, he continued. I let pride and anger, no fear, make me push you away. I thought I was protecting my marriage, but I was destroying my family. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Ethan, I said softly, I don't hate you. I never did. But forgiveness doesn't erase what's broken. It just gives us a chance to rebuild differently. He nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. I know, he whispered. I want that chance, Mom, I really do. Rebecca shifted in her chair, finally speaking. Marissa, she said carefully, I owe you an apology too. I came into your home thinking I had to take control. I wanted everything to look perfect, but I didn't realize I was tearing apart something sacred. I studied her for a long moment. Her tone was steady, but there was real regret beneath it. You hurt me, I said simply. You made me feel like a guest in my own life. She nodded, her lips trembling slightly. I know, and I hate myself for it. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. So why are you really here? I asked. Ethan hesitated. We lost the apartment, he admitted. The rent went up. We've been staying with a friend, but it's not working out. I'm not here to ask for handouts, Mom. I just didn't know where else to go. His words hit me harder than I expected. The house that had once been our refuge now stood between us like a wall of consequences. So you came because you had no choice? I asked quietly. No, he said quickly. I came because I realized I can't fix my life without fixing what I broke with you first. Rebecca wiped her eyes silently. Marissa, I don't expect you to let us stay. We just wanted to see you. To make things right, if you'll let us. The air in the room shifted then. I could feel something breaking open, something fragile but real. I walked over to the window, looking out at the garden. The maple trees were shedding their last leaves, the wind scattering them across the yard. Seasons were changing, and maybe we were too. You know, I said after a while. Your father used to say forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. It's one you build, brick by brick. I turned back to them. If you're willing to build it with me, then maybe we can start again. Ethan's face crumpled. He stood, crossed the room, and pulled me into a hug so tight I could hardly breathe. I hadn't felt his arms around me in years, and for a moment, time disappeared. All the anger, the distance, the pain, it melted into something simple and human. Love. Rebecca stood up slowly, watching us. Then she stepped forward, her voice trembling. Can I hug you too? She asked quietly. I hesitated only a second before nodding. When her arms wrapped around me, it wasn't cold or forced. It was desperate and real, like two people finally finding the same rhythm after years of dissonance. When we pulled apart, I looked at them both. You can stay here for a while, I said. But things have to be different this time. No more disrespect. No more secrets. This is a home, not a battlefield. Ethan nodded firmly. Agreed, Rebecca whispered. Thank you. As the day faded into evening, I made dinner for 3 for the first time in months. We ate quietly, the clinking of forks sounding almost like music. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. Later that night, after they went to bed in the guest room, I stood alone in the living room, staring at the flickering shadows on the walls. The house felt alive again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was coming, something I couldn't see yet. Because forgiveness isn't the end of a story. It's just the beginning of another test. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, golden and soft, as if trying to bless this fragile new beginning. I stood by the stove, frying eggs and humming under my breath, something I hadn't done in years. The smell of breakfast filled the air, bacon, toast, and coffee, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt almost normal again. I could hear quiet voices coming from the guest room, Ethan and Rebecca whispering. There was a gentleness in their tone that hadn't been there before. When they finally came out, Ethan offered a shy smile. Smells amazing, Mom, he said, sliding into his old chair at the table. Rebecca followed, helping me set the plates. Can I do the orange juice? She asked. I nodded, a little surprised by her softness. As we ate, conversation flowed in hesitant bursts. Ethan talked about the small marketing firm he'd been working for before they had to move out, about how the job barely paid enough to cover the rent. Rebecca mentioned that she'd been trying to freelance as a designer but couldn't find steady work. It was humbling to hear them speak honestly for once, without the layer of pride that used to color every word. But beneath that small domestic peace, I could sense tension curling in the corners of the room, something unspoken. After breakfast, Ethan went outside to check the gutters, saying he wanted to help around the house. Rebecca stayed behind washing dishes. For a while, we worked side by side in silence. Then, without looking up, she said, "I know you're trying to trust me again, Marissa. I just hope I can earn it." I dried a plate slowly. "Trust takes time," I replied. "It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up." She nodded, her jaw tightening slightly. "I guess I'm still learning how to do that." I studied her face. There was a tiredness there deeper than exhaustion, something that looked like guilt mixed with fear. "You and Ethan have been through a lot, haven't you?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "More than we've admitted." I wanted to press, but before I could, Ethan's voice called from outside. "Mom, you gotta see this." We stepped onto the porch. Ethan was standing near the maple tree, holding a small wooden box, dusty and weathered. "Found it behind the shed," he said. My breath caught. That box had belonged to his father, Michael. Inside were old letters, photographs, and the pocket watch I'd given him on our 10th anniversary. Ethan opened it carefully, his fingers brushing over the contents. "I forgot how much he loved collecting things," he murmured. I smiled faintly. "He said memories were treasures, not burdens." Ethan looked up at me, eyes soft. He was right. We sat there for a while, flipping through the photos. There was one of Ethan as a little boy, sitting on his father's shoulders, both laughing so hard that their faces blurred in motion. I hadn't seen that picture in years. For a moment, it felt like Michael was still with us, quietly watching, gently guiding. That afternoon, the weather turned. Gray clouds rolled in, and by evening, the rain came hard and steady. The sound of it hitting the roof was almost comforting. We decided to watch an old movie together, something we used to do every Friday night when Ethan was young. It should have felt cozy, but halfway through the film, I noticed Rebecca growing restless. Her leg bounced, her gaze distant. I turned down the volume. "You okay?" I asked softly. She flinched slightly, then forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." But I didn't believe her. A few minutes later, she got up abruptly and went to the bathroom. When she didn't come back for a long time, I started to worry. I knocked gently on the door. "Rebecca?" No answer. I pushed it open slowly and found her sitting on the edge of the tub, her hands shaking, mascara smudged under her eyes. "What's going on?" I asked quietly. She looked up at me, eyes red. "I didn't just lose our apartment, Marissa. We're in debt. Bad debt." My stomach dropped. "Debt? Ethan doesn't know the full amount," she whispered. "I've been hiding it. I thought I could fix it on my own, but it's too late. The credit cards, the medical bills from when he got sick last year, it's all catching up." I sank to my knees beside her. "Rebecca, why didn't you tell him?" "Because he already blames himself for everything," she said, voice breaking. I couldn't add more. He's been trying so hard to prove he's a good husband, a good son. I didn't want him to feel like a failure again. My chest ached. "Secrets only make the cracks deeper," I said softly. "If you want this family to heal, everything has to come into the light." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. I just don't know how to tell him." I squeezed her hand gently. "Start with the truth. It's messy, but it's the only way through." That night, while the rain drummed against the windows, Rebecca told Ethan everything. I sat in the corner, watching the two of them crumble and rebuild in real time. Ethan's face went pale when he heard the numbers, the late notices, the lies. For a moment, I thought he might walk out again. But instead, he just closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and said, "Okay, then we face it together." Rebecca sobbed into his chest, whispering apologies over and over. He held her tighter, whispering, "We'll fix it, somehow." I felt something shift inside me as I watched them. They weren't the same people who'd arrived at my doorstep yesterday. The pride, the walls, the defensiveness, they were gone. What was left was something raw, painful, but true. When they went to bed, I stayed up by the window, staring into the rain. The reflection of the three of us flickered faintly in the glass, mother, son, and daughter-in-law, each carrying our own wounds, each choosing somehow to stay. I whispered a quiet prayer, thanking God for small mercies. But deep down, I knew this was only the surface of something bigger. Life has a way of testing love right after it begins to heal, and I could feel another storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The next morning came heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick and gray, a warning that something had shifted. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Rebecca was still upstairs, the sound of her faint footsteps moving slowly back and forth. I could tell she'd barely slept. I sat across from him, watching the way his eyes flickered between anger and exhaustion. "You should have told me," he finally said, his voice low, almost hollow. "She was trying to protect you," I replied softly. He shook his head. "Protect me from what? Reality?" He set the mug down too hard, the sound sharp against the stillness. "I'm the one who's supposed to protect her, Mom. I've failed at everything. The job, the apartment, the marriage." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You haven't failed, Ethan. You're still here. You're still trying. That's what matters." But he didn't meet my eyes. There's a particular ache a mother feels when she sees her child drowning in guilt, the kind you can't pull them out of, no matter how much love you throw their way. Rebecca came downstairs soon after, dressed but pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She hesitated in the doorway before saying quietly, "Ethan, can we talk?" He stood up, tension running through his shoulders. "Yeah, let's talk." They went outside, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the ghost of every conversation I'd ever had with Michael during our hardest days. Through the window, I could see them in the yard. Rebecca's hands were moving as she spoke, pleading, explaining. Ethan just stood there staring at the ground. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away toward the shed. She called after him, but he didn't stop. A few minutes later, the sound of the old truck engine broke through the still morning. Rebecca ran back inside, panic in her eyes. "He's leaving," she said breathlessly. He said he needed to clear his head. I followed her to the door, watching the dust rise as the truck disappeared down the road. My heart sank. "He'll come back," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. The day dragged on like a wound that wouldn't close. Rebecca tried to stay busy, folding laundry, sweeping the porch, starting dinner, but her movements were frantic, mechanical. At one point, she just stood in the hallway staring at a photo of Ethan as a boy, her lips trembling. "He used to smile like that all the time, didn't he?" she murmured. I nodded slowly. "He's always been tender-hearted. That's why the world hits him harder than most." The hours stretched into evening, and still no sign of him. When night fell, I finally convinced Rebecca to rest on the couch while I sat by the window, waiting. The roads were empty, except for the occasional flash of headlights in the distance. I tried to pray, but my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. I rushed to the door just as Ethan stepped out of the truck, soaked to the bone though there hadn't been rain. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears and dirt. Rebecca ran to him, but he held up a hand. "Just give me a second," he said, his voice hoarse. She froze, nodding. He turned to me. "Mom, I went to Dad's grave." My breath caught. "Oh, Ethan." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I told him everything. The debt, the lies, how lost I felt. I even told him I blamed him for leaving us when I was a kid. I said things I didn't mean. But by the end, I realized, I've been angry at myself this whole time. His voice cracked. I keep trying to be the man he was, but I'm not him. And I never will be. I stepped closer and touched his cheek. "You're not supposed to be him, Ethan. You're supposed to be you. That's all any of us can be." Rebecca's quiet sobs filled the air as she came closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you sooner." He looked at her then, the anger in his eyes fading into something softer, something broken but willing. "No more secrets," he said. "Ever." She nodded quickly, tears glistening in the faint porch light. "I promise." He reached for her hand, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something fragile but beautiful, a choice to stay even when it hurt. We went inside together, exhausted but united. Ethan sat by the fire while Rebecca made tea. I brought out the old wooden box again and set it on the coffee table. Maybe, I said quietly, it's time we stopped holding on to the pain. We each took something from the box, a photo, a letter, a trinket, and shared a memory of Michael. We laughed a little, cried a lot. By the time the fire burned low, the air in the room felt different. Lighter. Like we had finally made room for Grace to enter. But just when I thought we were finding peace, Rebecca's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, and her face went white. I frowned. What is it? She hesitated, then handed it to Ethan. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. A man's name appeared above the text. The message read, "You can't ignore this forever. I need the money by next week or everyone finds out." Ethan's hands clenched around the phone, his jaw tightening. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Rebecca's lips parted, but no sound came out. "Rebecca," I said firmly, "what does he mean? Everyone finds out." She sank into the chair, trembling. "It's someone I borrowed from," she whispered. "Not a bank. A private lender? When the bills piled up, I didn't know what else to do." Ethan's voice broke through like thunder. "A private lender? You mean a loan shark?" She covered her face, sobbing. "I thought I could fix it before you ever found out." Ethan stood up, pacing, anger radiating from every movement. I could feel the storm building again, the kind that tears families apart if you're not careful. I stood between them and said quietly, "We'll handle this together." Not in anger. "Not tonight." Ethan stopped, breathing hard, eyes burning with betrayal and fear. "If he's threatening her, we call the police," I continued. "But first, we calm down." Rebecca nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to protect us. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before finally collapsing onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. None of us spoke after that. The weight of what we had just learned sat between us like a ghost, cold, quiet, and waiting for dawn. The next few days felt like walking through fog. Every sound seemed sharper, every silence heavier. Ethan barely spoke. Rebecca moved like a ghost through the house, her shoulders bent under a weight she could no longer hide. I tried to keep things normal, cooking, cleaning, pretending the world wasn't falling apart around us. But deep down, I could feel something closing in. On the third night after that message, I heard a car pull up outside. It was late, close to midnight, and the sound of tires crunching gravel sent a chill down my spine. I went to the window and peeked through the curtain. A dark sedan was parked near the edge of the driveway. The engine idled for a moment before the lights went out. My breath caught when I saw a tall man step out, his coat collar turned up, his face half hidden in the dark. He stood there for a few seconds, looking straight at the house, then slipped something into the mailbox and walked back to the car. The vehicle pulled away slowly, its headlights disappearing down the road. I waited until it was gone, then hurried outside, clutching my robe around me. Inside the mailbox was a plain white envelope. No name, no address, just a small black mark in the corner, like an inked fingerprint. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 words, written in thick, uneven letters. "Time's running out." The next morning, I showed it to Ethan. His face drained of color as he read it. "It's him," he said flatly. "The lender." Rebecca stood by the counter, her face pale. "He said he wouldn't come here," she whispered, shaking her head. "He promised me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And you believed him?" His voice was sharp, cutting, but beneath it I heard the tremor of fear. I stepped between them before the argument could ignite. "Enough," I said quietly but firmly. "We'll go to the police." Ethan looked at me with hollow eyes. "And tell them what, Mom? That my wife borrowed money from a criminal and now he's threatening us? They'll tell us to move or hide." Rebecca's voice cracked. "We can't move again. We have nowhere else to go. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock above the stove. I could feel their despair circling us, feeding on the uncertainty. "Then we fight differently," I said. "We stay calm. We keep watch. We don't let fear decide what happens next." That day, Ethan called his old boss asking for extra shifts. He started leaving early, coming home late, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Rebecca tried to sell some of her artwork online, but no one was buying. I went through the old chest in the attic, pulling out whatever I could find that might help. A few pieces of jewelry, some antiques, anything worth a few $100s. It wasn't much, but it was something. At night, I prayed longer than usual, whispering Michael's name under my breath, asking him to watch over us. But prayer didn't stop the fear from creeping in. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of a knock at the door. Not loud, just deliberate. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 in the morning. My heart thudded in my chest. I slipped out of bed and moved quietly down the hall. The knock came again, this time harder. "Ethan!" I hissed, shaking his shoulder. He woke with a start, confused, then alert. "Stay here," he said, throwing on his jacket. Rebecca stirred, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't open it." He ignored her and stepped into the living room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who is it?" he called out. Silence. Then a voice, a low, gravelly tone that made my blood run cold. "Just here for a reminder." Ethan opened the door a crack. A folded piece of paper slid through the gap and landed on the floor. "You've got 5 days," the voice said. Then footsteps fading away into the night. Ethan locked the door and picked up the paper. It was a notice with numbers scribbled across it, an amount so high I could hardly breathe. Rebecca began to sob quietly, her face buried in her hands. "I'll fix it," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I don't know how yet, but I'll fix it." The next morning, the tension was unbearable. We barely ate. Every sound outside made us jump. Rebecca stayed close to me, flinching at every passing car. Ethan tried to act strong, but I could see the desperation tightening around him like a noose. That afternoon, he came to me in the garden. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "I need to ask you something." I looked up from the flowers I'd been tending, my hands dirty with soil. "Anything." He hesitated, shame flickering across his face. "Do you still have the savings Dad left behind?" My throat tightened. "You mean the emergency fund?" He nodded. "I don't want to take it, but if I don't pay this man, he'll come back. And next time, it won't just be a letter." I studied his face. The boy I'd raised was gone. In his place stood a man trying to carry the world on his back. I walked to the porch and came back with a small metal tin. "This is everything," I said quietly. "It's not much, but it's yours if it keeps you safe." He opened the tin, eyes wet. "You shouldn't have to fix my mistakes." I touched his cheek. "I'm not fixing them. I'm keeping my family alive." That night, he left with the money. Rebecca and I waited in silence, neither of us daring to speak. When he finally returned, hours later, his face was pale but calm. "It's done," he said simply. He said it's enough for now. Rebecca threw her arms around him, crying into his chest. I wanted to believe it was over, but something in Ethan's voice, too steady, too quiet, told me it wasn't. After they went to bed, I found the tin still on the counter. Inside was a small note, one I hadn't seen before. It was folded neatly, written in my husband's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means things got hard again. But remember, money can be replaced. People can't." My eyes filled with tears. I sat there in the dark, clutching the note, whispering, "I know, Michael. I know." The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I wanted to believe we'd finally bought peace, but deep in my chest, I felt it. The uneasy certainty that this was only the eye of the storm. Something darker was coming, and this time it wouldn't just be about money. It would be about who we truly were when everything safe was stripped away. As night fell over the village, only a small fire flickered by the porch, and the sound of crickets filled the air like the whisper of the earth itself. Daniel sat quietly, watching the flames dance, his heart heavy with what he had just heard. Earlier that evening, he had visited an old friend named Samuel, a man who had once been a Pharisee. Samuel told him something that made sleep impossible. The religious leaders were plotting to trap and arrest Jesus. They claimed he was a threat to their authority, a danger to their traditions. Daniel could hardly believe it. He knew Jesus wasn't like the men who craved power or fame. Every word he spoke overflowed with compassion, and every act he performed reached out to those the world had forgotten. How could anyone hate such a man enough to want him dead? That thought sent a strange fear through Daniel's soul. Part of him wanted to run, to stay far away from the chaos that was coming. But deep inside, another voice urged him to stay, to protect the one he believed was the true light of the world. The wind whispered through the trees that night, carrying the scent of grass and damp earth after rain. Then Daniel heard soft footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Mary, the woman he once rescued from an angry crowd ready to stone her. Her face was calm, yet her eyes carried deep worry. "Daniel," she said softly, "he's in danger. They've already decided. I heard them say they're just waiting for the right moment." Daniel nodded, his voice low and steady. "I know, Samuel told me. But Mary, I can't just sit here and do nothing." Mary stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What will you do? We're just ordinary people. What can we possibly change?" Daniel was silent for a long while. Then he said, "Maybe I can't change what's coming, but I can't pretend I don't know. If his love truly comes from heaven, then the least I can do is stand by him till the end." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She lowered her head, her hands trembling. "I'm so afraid, Daniel. Afraid of losing him. Afraid of losing the faith I just found." Daniel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his tone firm yet warm. "We won't lose our faith, Mary. We might lose him, but his love will make our faith live on." Those words lit a fragile spark of hope in Mary's heart. She looked up at him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Then we'll go find him?" Daniel nodded. They gathered a few belongings and set off together. The dirt road was slick from rain, and the dim moon hung like a weary veil across the sky. The wind howled through the hills, keeping pace with their hesitant yet determined steps. Along the way, Mary told Daniel about the first time she met Jesus, the day she had been dragged out to be stoned for her sins. "You know," she said quietly, "he didn't look at me like everyone else. His eyes saw everything I'd done, but they still loved me. He gave me a reason to live again." Daniel listened silently, his heart heavy with compassion and gratitude. "He looked at me the same way," Daniel replied softly. "Not as someone who must prove himself, but as someone already forgiven." As they approached Jerusalem, voices carried through the dawn air. People were talking about how Jesus had just driven the merchants out of the temple. "He said his father's house isn't a marketplace," one man recounted. "He flipped the tables and drove them all out." Everyone was shocked. Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew that act would enrage the powerful even more. "He knows they'll kill him," Daniel whispered, "and yet he still did it." Mary looked at him, her voice trembling. "Maybe because he wants us to see that love isn't about compromise. Sometimes you must choose between safety and truth." Her words struck Daniel deeply. He remembered what Jesus once said, "Whoever wants to follow me must take up his cross." He hadn't truly understood it until now. Following him wasn't the path of miracles and glory. It was the path of sacrifice, of tears, and of love that doesn't fear pain. As they reached the Mount of Olives, the first rays of dawn spread across the horizon, painting the eastern sky in soft gold. Daniel stopped and looked toward the city, where the temple shimmered in the morning light. "Mary," he said, "if something terrible happens, remember this. He chose that path not because he was powerless, but because he loved." Mary nodded, tears glistening, yet a faint smile touched her lips. "Then we'll choose to love too, even if it hurts." In that moment, Daniel realized that true love isn't the absence of fear or loss. It's the courage to keep walking even when the road leads through sorrow. The sunlight fell upon them gently, as if heaven itself whispered a quiet blessing. And together, they continued toward Jerusalem, where their faith would be tested to its breaking point, but where they would also witness the greatest revelation of all, that love never fails. The streets of Jerusalem were bursting with noise, the air thick with tension and dust. Daniel and Mary slipped into the crowd, their cloaks pulled tightly to avoid attention. People were whispering, rumors spreading like wildfire. Some said Jesus was a prophet who would free them from Rome. Others spat in disgust, calling him a deceiver. But what struck Daniel most was the fear that rippled through every conversation. Even those who had once shouted his name in joy now avoided speaking it too loudly. Power was shifting, and darkness was moving in. They reached a small courtyard near the marketplace, where Jesus was teaching. The crowd had gathered despite the risk. His voice was calm, gentle yet filled with unshakable authority. "Do not let your hearts be troubled," he said. "Trust in God, and trust also in me." His words wrapped around Daniel like a warm embrace. For a moment, the chaos of the world faded away, but that peace shattered when a group of temple guards appeared at the edge of the courtyard. The crowd froze. Mary's hand gripped Daniel's arm tightly. The guards didn't move yet. They only watched, waiting for an order. Jesus continued speaking, as if unaware of the threat. He spoke of love, of forgiveness, of a kingdom not of this world. His eyes met Daniel's for a fleeting second, and in that single glance, Daniel felt both exposed and comforted, as if Jesus saw every fear in his soul and still called him worthy. Then a voice broke through the silence. It was Judas. He stepped forward from the shadows, his face pale, his eyes heavy with guilt and greed. Daniel's heart dropped. Judas had been one of them, one who'd shared bread and laughter beside the fire. Jesus looked at him tenderly, not with anger, but sorrow. "Friend," he said softly, "do what you came for." And at that moment, the guards moved in. The torches flared, the clinking of armor echoed, and chaos erupted. Daniel instinctively pushed Mary behind him as the crowd scattered. Some screamed, others cried out prayers. Peter, furious, drew a blade and struck one of the guards, but Jesus stopped him. "Put your sword away," he said. "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Daniel watched in disbelief as Jesus allowed himself to be bound. The soldiers mocked him, calling him the false king. Daniel's fists trembled with rage. He wanted to fight, to scream, to do anything. But he remembered Jesus' eyes, that calm acceptance. The realization struck him like lightning. This was no accident. Jesus was choosing this, choosing to walk into suffering, choosing love even when the world answered with hate. When the soldiers dragged Jesus away, Daniel felt his legs weaken. Mary fell to her knees, sobbing. "They're taking him," she whispered. "They're going to kill him." Daniel knelt beside her, holding her close. "We'll follow," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll go wherever they take him." The night grew colder as they followed the torches winding through the streets toward the high priest's house. Every few steps, Daniel's thoughts raced. Why didn't he run? Why didn't he call the angels he spoke of? And yet deep inside, a different truth stirred. He didn't come to escape the pain. He came to transform it. At the courtyard of the high priest, the guards pushed Jesus inside for questioning. Daniel and Mary stayed outside, hiding near the shadows by the fire where others had gathered to watch. They saw Peter there too, his face pale and tense. Moments later, someone pointed at him and shouted, "You were with him!" Peter shook his head, denying it. Again and again they accused, and each time he denied. On the third denial, a rooster crowed. Peter's face crumbled, and he fled into the night, sobbing. The sound pierced Daniel's chest. He understood that pain too well, the shame of loving someone and feeling helpless to defend them. Mary leaned against the wall, whispering, "Why must it be this way?" Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Hours later, the trial began. The leaders shouted accusations, twisting every word Jesus had ever said. They called him a blasphemer, a liar, a danger to peace. Through it all, Jesus remained silent. When they struck him across the face, he didn't retaliate. When they mocked him, he didn't defend himself. The calm on his face was almost unbearable to witness. Then came the moment that broke Daniel's heart. The crowd that once shouted, "Hosanna," now screamed, "Crucify him." Pilate, uneasy and confused, tried to reason with them, but they wouldn't relent. "Crucify him!" The people roared, their voices blending into one monstrous sound. Mary covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. Daniel wanted to scream at them, to shake them, to make them see what they were doing, but no one listened. The choice had been made. Love was about to be nailed to a cross. The sun rose on a city drenched in bitterness. The soldiers led Jesus through the narrow streets, forcing him to carry the heavy wooden cross. Daniel and Mary followed from a distance, their hearts breaking with every stumble he took. Blood stained the stones beneath his feet. Every whip cracked like thunder in the silence of morning. At one point, Jesus fell to his knees, too weak to stand. A soldier grabbed a stranger from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, and forced him to help carry the cross. Daniel wanted to run forward, to take Simon's place, but fear rooted him to the ground. He hated himself for it. When they reached Golgotha, the soldiers began their grim work. The hammering of nails echoed across the hills, and every strike felt like it shattered Daniel's soul. Mary could barely stand. Daniel held her as they watched the one who had healed, forgiven, and loved more deeply than anyone else, being lifted on a cross between two thieves. The sky began to darken, though it was only midday. The wind howled, and the earth seemed to groan in sorrow. Jesus looked down at the crowd, at those who mocked him, at those who wept, at those who had betrayed him, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Daniel fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. How could he still forgive them? How could love endure even now, in the face of cruelty and death? Mary whispered through her sobs, "He's not just dying for them. He's dying for all of us." Daniel looked at her, and for the first time he understood. This was not defeat. This was the victory of love that refused to give up on a broken world. And as Jesus' final breath left his body, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The veil of the temple tore in two, and Daniel knew the world would never be the same again. The storm rolled across the hills like the fury of heaven itself. Lightning flashed above the city, illuminating the crosses standing on Golgotha. Daniel and Mary stayed until the soldiers finally lowered Jesus' body. Rain poured down, washing the dust and blood into the earth, as if the sky itself wept for what humanity had done. Daniel's clothes were soaked, his heart shattered into pieces he couldn't put back together. He helped Joseph of Arimathea carry Jesus' body to the tomb, wrapping him in linen, every touch trembling with disbelief. The smell of myrrh filled the air, thick and bittersweet. When they rolled the stone across the entrance, Daniel felt a final, devastating silence fall over everything. The man who had calmed storms, healed the blind, raised the dead, now lay lifeless behind a cold wall of rock. As they walked back toward the city, no one spoke. Mary's steps were slow, her face pale beneath the gray sky. "It shouldn't have ended like this," she whispered. Daniel didn't know how to answer. His voice, once filled with conviction, now felt hollow. Every word Jesus had spoken echoed in his mind, about faith, about love, about rising again. But right now, all Daniel could feel was loss. He wanted to believe, but his heart was crushed under the weight of grief. The next days passed in a haze. The world seemed to hold its breath. The streets were quiet, and even the birds stopped singing. Daniel stayed in the upper room with a few of the disciples, all of them haunted by guilt and fear. Peter sat in the corner, his face buried in his hands, whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. "I denied him," he kept saying. "I said I didn't know him." Daniel wanted to tell him that he understood, that he too had been frozen by fear, but the words stuck in his throat. None of them ate. None of them slept. Every sound outside made them jump, afraid the soldiers would come for them next. Mary went out early one morning before sunrise. She said she wanted to bring spices to the tomb. Daniel tried to stop her, but she only smiled weakly and said, "I need to see him one more time." So she left. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in gold, and Daniel sat by the window staring at nothing. Then suddenly the door burst open. Mary rushed in, her face flushed, her eyes wide with something Daniel hadn't seen in days. Light. "He's gone!" she cried. "The stone, it's moved. The tomb is empty." Everyone froze. Peter leapt to his feet, his voice hoarse. "What do you mean empty?" But Mary's words tumbled out like water. "I saw him. I swear I saw him. I thought he was the gardener, but when he said my name, Daniel, when he said my name, it was him." The room erupted in disbelief. Some shouted, some wept, others sat in stunned silence. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe her so badly it hurt. Without a word, he ran out the door, his feet pounding against the cobblestone streets. The world seemed alive again, the air sharp, the wind fierce. When he reached the tomb, the stone was indeed rolled away. Inside, the linen cloths lay neatly folded. The place where his body had been was empty. Daniel fell to his knees. His hands touched the cold stone, and for the first time, tears fell not from despair, but from awe. "You did it," he whispered. "You truly did it." Behind him, Peter entered, gasping when he saw the same sight. The two men looked at each other, speechless. In that silence, something holy filled the air. A quiet promise, a power too deep for words. That night, as they gathered once more behind locked doors, the room suddenly filled with a light unlike any other. It wasn't fire or moonlight, it was living light, soft but powerful, and from it stepped Jesus. His wounds were still visible, but his face glowed with peace. "Do not be afraid," he said gently. "Peace be with you." Daniel's heart stopped. Every fear, every doubt, every ounce of grief dissolved in that instant. He fell to his knees, trembling, unable to speak. Jesus looked at each of them with the same love he had shown before the cross, only now it was deeper, like the love of heaven itself. "As the Father has sent me," he said, "so I am sending you." The disciples wept openly. Peter could barely stand. Thomas, still shaken, whispered, "Is it truly you?" Jesus smiled, holding out his hands. "Put your finger here. See my wounds. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas touched the scar, and his eyes filled with tears. "My Lord and my God," he breathed. Daniel watched it all in stunned silence. He wanted to speak, but no words could contain what he felt. For the first time in his life, he understood that love had not been defeated. It had conquered death itself. In the days that followed, Jesus appeared to them again and again, sometimes by the Sea of Galilee, where he shared breakfast with them over a crackling fire. Other times on the road, walking beside them, explaining the scriptures that once seemed like mysteries. Daniel never forgot one moment in particular, when Jesus took him aside and said, "You once feared that love would fail you. But Daniel, love cannot die. It can only rise again." Those words stayed with him long after Jesus ascended into the clouds. The day of the ascension was both beautiful and heartbreaking. They stood on a hill overlooking Jerusalem, and Jesus told them, "Go into all the world and share what you've seen. Tell them love is alive." Then, with eyes lifted toward heaven, he was taken up in light until they could see him no more. Daniel stood there long after the others had left. The sky glowed with sunset, and the wind brushed against his face like a gentle reminder. He realized that everything he had seen, the pain, the cross, the empty tomb, wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something eternal. He walked back to the city as the evening bells rang, his steps steady, his heart no longer heavy. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of life. Children laughing, families eating together, the sun painting gold across the rooftops. The world that had once seemed broken now shimmered with new light. Mary met him on the road. She smiled through tears. "We saw him," she said softly. "We truly saw him." Daniel took her hand, squeezing it gently. "And now," he said. It's our turn to love the way he did. Without fear, without limits, without end. They stood there as the sky darkened into night, the stars beginning to appear one by one, as if heaven itself was opening its eyes to watch. Daniel knew life would never be easy, that the road ahead would still carry sorrow and sacrifice. But beneath it all burned a quiet certainty, the promise that love had already won. And as he looked toward the heavens, he whispered the truth that would guide him forever. He's not gone. He's here, in every act of kindness, in every heart that chooses love over hate, in every soul that dares to believe again. Years passed, and the world continued to change. Yet the memory of that day, the day love triumphed over death, never left Daniel. He became a traveler, moving from town to town, sharing what he had seen, telling the story of the man who conquered fear with forgiveness and death with love. People would gather in marketplaces, in quiet homes, and under olive trees just to listen. Some came curious, others skeptical, and many came broken. But every time Daniel spoke the name of Jesus, something stirred in the air. Hope. The same hope that had once lifted him from despair now touched those around him. One evening, in a small coastal village, a young widow approached Daniel after he finished speaking. Her eyes were red from tears. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "My husband, my faith, even my reason to live. How can I still believe that love exists in a world that takes so much?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his expression tender. "I once asked that same question," he said softly. "I watched the man I believed in, the man who healed, forgave, and loved, crucified before my eyes. For a long time I thought love had died on that cross. But then I saw the tomb empty. I saw him alive again. And I realized love isn't what life takes away. Love is what survives after everything else falls apart." The woman's eyes filled with silent tears. Daniel placed a hand over hers. "You see, love isn't about being spared from pain. It's about finding light even when the night refuses to end. If you still have the strength to care, to forgive, to believe even a little, then love still lives in you." She nodded slowly, as if something deep inside her had just been reignited. Later that night, Daniel sat alone by the shore. The waves lapped gently against the rocks, and the moonlight stretched across the sea like a silver path leading home. He thought about all he had lost, all he had gained, and all he still didn't understand. The journey had not been easy. He had faced rejection, loneliness, hunger, and countless nights wondering if his words were enough. But then he would remember Jesus' final command, "Love one another as I have loved you." That was the answer to every question, the cure for every wound. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, I understand now." Love was never meant to protect us from pain. It was meant to carry us through it. Over time, Daniel became known as the storyteller of Galilee. Not because he was eloquent, but because his stories made people feel. He spoke of love that healed wounds no one could see, of forgiveness that set souls free, of courage born from surrender. And wherever his words went, hearts began to soften. One afternoon, a young man approached him, fiery with ambition and questions. "Why should I live for love?" he demanded. "It only makes people weak. Look at this world. It rewards the strong, not the kind." Daniel smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "You think love makes you weak?" he asked. "Then tell me, who had more strength than the one who carried a cross for those who mocked him? Who had more power than the one who forgave when the world betrayed him?" The young man frowned, silent. Daniel continued, "Power can conquer others, but only love can conquer the heart. Power builds walls. Love tears them down. Power fades with time, but love, it leaves a mark that even death can't erase." That night, Daniel shared his final message with the people gathered around him. The firelight danced on their faces as he spoke. "My friends," he began, his voice gentle yet full of conviction, "we live in a world still haunted by fear, greed, and pain. But don't let it make you bitter. Remember what he taught us. not to curse the darkness, but to be the light within it. Because love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice, a daily choice. To forgive when you want to hate. To believe when everything tells you to give up. To give when the world takes. The people listened in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between his words. Daniel looked up at the sky, stars stretching across the night like 1,000 tiny promises. "If you remember anything," he said softly, "remember this. Love never loses. It might look defeated for a moment, it might even hang on a cross, but it always rises again. Always." He paused, letting the words sink into their hearts. Then he smiled, his eyes shining with the peace of someone who had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. "And when you go home tonight," he said, "don't just tell this story. Live it, show it, because every act of love is another resurrection." As the crowd dispersed, Mary, older now but still radiant with quiet strength, walked up to Daniel. "You've carried his message well," she said softly. "Do you ever wonder what he's doing now?" Daniel looked at her, his face glowing in the firelight. "He's still here," he said. "In every act of kindness, in every tear forgiven, in every broken heart that learns to love again." Mary smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then we're still walking with him." Daniel nodded. "We always will." That night, as Daniel lay beneath the stars, the wind carried the faint echo of waves crashing against the shore, and he felt it again, that same presence he'd felt years ago by the empty tomb. Not a vision, not a voice, but a peace that filled every corner of his being, and in that peace he whispered his final prayer. "Thank you for teaching me that love is stronger than life and greater than death." His story didn't end that night. It lives on in every heart that hears it, in every person who decides to forgive, to hope, to start again. Because Daniel's story isn't just about him, it's about all of us. It's about every time you've been broken and still chose to love, every time you've fallen and still stood up, every time you've been afraid and still dared to believe. So if you're listening to this right now, if you've felt lost, hurt, or alone, remember this truth. Love hasn't given up on you. It's waiting inside you, ready to rise again. You just have to open your heart and let it. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that love still matters in a world that often forgets, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it, leave a comment, subscribe. Because the more we spread love, the more light we bring into the darkness. Let's build a world where love doesn't just survive, it leads. Because when we choose love, we don't just tell his story, we continue it.